Family, let me tell you something you may not feel yet, you may not see yet, and you may not even believe yet, but God is about to surprise you. We serve a God who specializes in showing up unexpectedly, suddenly, and decisively. Just when you think the door is closed, heaven says, watch this. Just when you think the clock has run out, God says, I don't operate by your schedule. Some of you have been praying for a long time. Others have stopped praying because you got tired of waiting. But hear this clearly, delay is not denial. God is not late. He's positioning everything so that when it happens, only He gets the glory. Scripture tells us that God does exceedingly and abundantly above all we ask or think. That means He doesn't just meet expectations, He exceeds them. He doesn't just answer prayers, He answers them in ways that leave no doubt it was Him. You may be looking at your situation and seeing lack, confusion, or opposition, but God is looking at the same situation and seeing an opportunity to demonstrate His power. What you call impossible, God calls preparation. The Red Sea didn't part until the people stepped forward. The walls didn't fall until the people shouted. The blessing didn't come until obedience was activated. Your surprise is connected to your faith and your obedience, even when it doesn't make sense. So don't quit now. Don't retreat now. Don't settle now. You're closer than you think. Heaven has already scheduled what earth hasn't seen yet. Tell your neighbor, it's coming. Tell your doubt, it's coming. Tell your fear, it's coming. Because when God decides to move, no enemy can stop it, no delay can cancel it, and no past can disqualify it. Get ready. Stay faithful. Keep walking. God is about to surprise you, and it's coming. We serve a God who does not move according to human predictability. He is not limited by patterns, trends, or statistics. When people think they have God figured out, that is usually the moment He does something completely unexpected. Throughout Scripture, God reveals Himself as a God of surprises, not to confuse His people, but to remind them that He is sovereign, creative, and fully in control. Just when situations look final, God introduces something new that no one saw coming. Human nature looks for signs, formulas, and timelines. We want to know exactly when, how, and through whom God will act. But God often works outside of our expectations so that faith, not logic, remains the foundation of our walk with Him. If God always moved in ways we could predict, we would trust the process more than we trust Him. That is why His greatest works often happen suddenly, without warning, and beyond human explanation. In the Bible, God repeatedly shows up when hope seems gone. Sarah was well past the age of childbearing when God surprised her with a promise and then fulfilled it. Joseph went from a prison cell to the palace in a single day, not because of careful planning, but because God shifted circumstances instantly. Israel stood trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. And when there was no visible exit, God created a way where none existed. These moments were not accidents, they were divine interruptions. God's surprises often come after seasons of waiting, confusion, and even disappointment. Many people assume that if God is silent, He is inactive. But silence does not mean absence. While nothing appears to be happening on the surface, God is working behind the scenes, aligning people, timing, and conditions. What looks like stillness is often preparation. God is arranging the moment when His intervention will be undeniable. Another reason God works unexpectedly is so that no one can take credit for what only He can do. When the solution comes from an unlikely source, at an unlikely time, in an unlikely way, it becomes clear that human effort was not the cause. God removes the possibility of pride by removing predictability. When the blessing finally arrives, all that can be said is, only God could have done this. God's surprises also challenge our limited understanding of how He chooses to work. We often assume God will use the most qualified, the most experienced, or the most obvious option. But God frequently chooses the overlooked, the underestimated, and the unqualified. He called a shepherd boy to defeat a giant. He used fishermen to spread a global message. He chose a manger instead of a palace to introduce salvation to the world. God delights in overturning human expectations. Many people miss God's surprises because they are looking in the wrong direction. They expect God to move in familiar ways, but He is doing a new thing. They expect Him to use familiar people, but He raises up unexpected instruments. They expect immediate results, but God is working in layers and stages. Remaining open to God's unexpected ways requires humility, trust, and spiritual sensitivity. The unexpected move of God often demands a response before clarity arrives. When Peter stepped out of the boat, the water did not become solid first. When the priests stepped into the Jordan River, the water did not part until their feet touched it. God often asks for movement before manifestation. His surprises are activated when faith chooses obedience over certainty. God's unexpected interventions are not random, they are purposeful. They realign lives, restore hope, and redirect destinies. What seems like a sudden breakthrough is usually the result of God's long-term planning. He knows exactly when to step in, exactly how to step in, and exactly what result He intends to produce. His timing may surprise us, but it is always precise. When God surprises His people, it strengthens their faith for future challenges. Once you have seen God move in an unexpected way, you are less likely to panic the next time circumstances look impossible. Past surprises become reminders that God is not limited by what you see, feel, or understand. Each unexpected move becomes evidence that He is faithful and trustworthy. God's pattern of surprise is an invitation to live with expectation rather than fear. Instead of assuming the worst, faith learns to anticipate God's involvement. Even in uncertainty, even in delay, even in struggle, there is room to believe that God is preparing something beyond imagination. The same God who moved unexpectedly before is still moving today, and He has not lost His ability to astonish His people. Waiting is one of the most challenging experiences for anyone who trusts God. When prayers go unanswered and circumstances remain unchanged, it is easy to assume that God has said no. But in God's economy, waiting often has nothing to do with rejection and everything to do with preparation. What feels like denial to us is frequently a process that God is using to develop something deeper, stronger, and more lasting within us. Delay confronts our desire for control. We want immediate results because they reassure us that we are on the right path. God, however, is more concerned with alignment than speed. He is not only answering the requests we bring to Him, He is also shaping the person who is bringing the request. If the blessing arrives before the character is ready, the gift can become a burden instead of a benefit. God's timing protects us from receiving something we are not yet prepared to steward. Throughout Scripture, delay is a consistent part of God's plan. Abraham received the promise of a son long before the fulfillment arrived. The gap between promise and manifestation tested his faith, obedience, and trust. During that waiting period, God was not changing His mind. He was establishing His covenant and revealing His faithfulness. The delay did not weaken the promise, it strengthened it. Many people confuse God's silence with God's absence. But silence is often God's way of teaching us to listen more closely and trust more deeply. When there are no immediate answers, faith is no longer supported by visible evidence. It is supported by confidence in God's character. This is where spiritual maturity is formed. Waiting strips away shallow faith and replaces it with endurance. Delay also exposes the motives of the heart. It reveals whether we desire God's blessing or God Himself. When the answer is slow, we discover whether our relationship with God is conditional or committed. Waiting teaches us to worship without receiving, to obey without understanding, and to trust without explanation. These lessons cannot be learned in moments of instant gratification. God uses delay to align circumstances beyond what we can see. While we are focused on our immediate need, God is working on multiple levels at once. He is arranging people, opening doors, closing others, and coordinating events that must come together at the right time. What appears to be inactivity is often complex divine orchestration. If God acted too soon, the outcome would be incomplete or temporary. Delay also protects us from outcomes we are not ready to handle. There are blessings that, if received too early, would overwhelm us emotionally, spiritually, or relationally. God's love is demonstrated not only in what he gives, but in when he gives it. He knows the right season for growth, expansion, and responsibility. Waiting ensures that when the blessing arrives, it adds stability rather than chaos. In the waiting period, God often calls his people to keep moving forward in obedience. Delay does not mean life is on hold. God expects faithfulness in the small things while we wait for the bigger answer. David was anointed king long before he ever sat on the throne. Yet during the delay, he learned leadership, humility, and dependence on God. The waiting season became the training ground for the calling. Delay also teaches us to release our timeline and embrace God's sovereignty. When our plans fall apart, we are reminded that God's perspective is eternal. He sees the beginning, the middle, and the end all at once. What feels like a setback is often a setup for something greater than we imagined. God's delay refines our vision so that when he moves, we recognize his wisdom. One of the most difficult truths about delay is that it requires trust without visible progress. Faith must operate without confirmation. Yet this is precisely where faith becomes powerful. Waiting stretches belief beyond convenience and into dependence. It teaches us that God's promises are not fragile, they are resilient. Time does not weaken them, opposition does not cancel them, and delay does not diminish them. God's faithfulness is not measured by speed, but by certainty. If he has spoken, the outcome is secure, regardless of how long it takes. Delay does not mean God has changed his mind. It means he is ensuring that when the answer comes, it will be complete, lasting, and aligned with his purpose. What God has promised will arrive at the appointed time, and nothing in the waiting is wasted. Many people look at their circumstances and conclude that nothing good can come from what they are facing. They see obstacles, losses, opposition, and uncertainty, and they assume that something has gone wrong. But God often allows situations that appear negative because he intends to use them as the foundation for something greater. Looks like a setback is frequently a setup designed to reveal God's power and purpose. Human perspective tends to judge situations by appearance and immediate outcome. God, however, judges by potential and long-term impact. Where people see chaos, God sees opportunity. Where people see failure, God sees preparation. Circumstances that seem to work against us are often the very tools God uses to position us for growth, breakthrough, and transformation. Scripture consistently shows God using difficult situations to accomplish divine outcomes. Joseph's betrayal by his brothers looked like injustice and loss, yet it placed him on the path to leadership and influence. The famine that followed was not a coincidence. It was the very circumstance that made his position essential. What others intended for harm, God repurposed for good. The situation was not a mistake, it was a setup. God often allows pressure because pressure reveals what is inside. When life is comfortable, character is rarely tested. But in moments of difficulty, faith is refined, dependence on God deepens, and priorities become clear. Trials strip away self-reliance and force us to lean on God's strength rather than our own. The struggle itself becomes part of the preparation for what is coming next. Many people ask God to remove the problem without realizing that the problem is shaping them for their purpose. God is not just interested in changing circumstances, He is interested in changing people. If God solved everything instantly, spiritual growth would be shallow. The challenge is not evidence of God's absence. It is often proof of His involvement. Opposition is another sign that God may be at work. Resistance often arises when purpose is being activated. Throughout the Bible, breakthroughs are frequently preceded by conflict. Before Israel entered the Promised Land, they faced battles that strengthened their trust in God. Before the message spread globally, early believers encountered persecution that forced them beyond their comfort zones. Opposition became the catalyst for expansion. God also uses limitations as part of His setup. When resources are scarce and options are few, dependence on God becomes unavoidable. This is where God demonstrates that His power is not tied to abundance. He multiplied a small meal to feed thousands. He used a small army to defeat a vast one. By reducing human advantage, God increases divine visibility. The limitation ensures that the victory points back to Him. Waiting seasons, confusion, and unanswered questions often serve a strategic purpose. God may withhold clarity because faith does not require full understanding. If God explained every step, trust would be replaced by logic. God invites His people to walk forward even when they cannot see the entire path. The uncertainty itself trains the heart to rely on God's direction rather than human reasoning. Some situations feel unfair and undeserved. People may do the right thing and still face hardship. Yet God's setup is not always about correction. Sometimes it is about positioning. Being faithful does not exempt anyone from difficulty, but it does ensure that difficulty is not wasted. God can use injustice, rejection, and disappointment to redirect lives toward His purpose. God's setup often includes people who challenge, test, or even oppose us. These relationships are not always meant to last, but they play a role in shaping wisdom, discernment, and resilience. Through these interactions, God teaches boundaries, humility, and dependence on Him rather than human approval. Even uncomfortable relationships can serve a divine purpose. When God is setting something up, the process often feels backward. Loss comes before gain. Humbling comes before elevation. Surrender comes before victory. These patterns are intentional. They ensure that when the outcome arrives, it rests on God's foundation rather than human effort. What feels like being reduced is often God creating space for increase. Faith recognizes that God is active even when circumstances appear contrary. Trusting that God is setting something up does not deny the pain or difficulty of the moment, but it does redefine its meaning. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Faith begins to ask, what is God preparing through this? Every situation, no matter how challenging, carries the potential to become part of God's plan. Nothing is wasted in His hands. What appears to be disorder is often divine design unfolding in ways we do not yet understand. God's setup may not look like progress at first, but in time, it reveals itself as purpose in motion. Obedience is often misunderstood as a passive or secondary part of faith, but in reality, it is the active expression of trust in God. Faith that remains only internal does not produce visible movement. God consistently connects breakthrough to obedience, not because He needs our actions, but because obedience positions us to experience what He has already decided to release. Breakthrough is not forced. It is unlocked when faith responds to God's direction. Many people desire God's intervention, but resist God's instructions. They want the outcome without the process, the promise without the obedience. Yet throughout Scripture, God rarely moves apart from a response of faith. When God speaks, He expects alignment. Obedience is the bridge between what God has promised and what we experience. God's instructions are not always logical or comfortable. They often challenge reason, pride, and fear. marching around walls instead of attacking them, stepping into water before it parts, or releasing what seems necessary in order to gain something greater, all require trust beyond understanding. God's ways are higher than human reasoning, and obedience requires surrendering the need to fully understand before acting. Delayed obedience is often disguised as caution or wisdom, but it still delays breakthrough. When God gives direction, timing matters. Obedience that waits for perfect conditions may never move at all. Many miss opportunities not because they rejected God's will, but because they hesitated until the moment passed. Faith moves when God speaks, not when circumstances feel safe. Obedience also requires humility. It acknowledges that God's perspective is greater than our own. Pride resists obedience because it wants control and credit. Humility allows us to trust that God knows what He is doing, even when the path seems uncertain. Breakthrough often begins when self-reliance ends. Small acts of obedience often precede major breakthroughs. God rarely starts with grand instructions. He tests faith with manageable steps. A conversation, a decision, a release, or a commitment may seem insignificant, yet it becomes the trigger for something much larger. Those who overlook small instructions may never reach larger outcomes. Faithfulness in the small creates access to the greater. Obedience does not always bring immediate results. Sometimes it produces resistance, misunderstanding, or temporary loss. This is where faith is tested. Obedience is not validated by instant success, but by alignment with God's will. When obedience is sustained despite lack of immediate reward, it demonstrates trust in God rather than dependence on outcomes. There are moments when obedience requires letting go. God may ask for something familiar, comfortable, or seemingly necessary. Releasing it can feel risky, but obedience acknowledges that God is the source, not the resource. What God asks us to surrender is often what He plans to replace with something greater. Breakthrough is often on the other side of release. Obedience also involves perseverance. God may give a direction that requires consistency over time. Repeated actions, daily faithfulness, and continued trust build spiritual endurance. Breakthrough is not always a single moment. Sometimes it is the result of sustained obedience over an extended period. Faith remains active even when progress appears slow. Fear is one of the greatest obstacles to obedience. Fear of failure, rejection, or loss can prevent movement. Obedience confronts fear by prioritizing God's voice over human emotion. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is obedience in spite of fear. Each obedient step weakens fear's control and strengthens trust. Obedience aligns us with God's authority. When we act according to His instruction, we place ourselves under His covering and guidance. This alignment creates spiritual momentum. Resistance decreases, clarity increases, and doors begin to open. Obedience does not earn God's favor, but it positions us to walk in what His favor has already made available. Breakthrough is not random or accidental. It follows obedience because obedience aligns our actions with God's purpose. When faith moves beyond belief into action, it creates space for God to move powerfully. Obedience turns faith into motion, and motion invites manifestation. There are moments in life when nothing appears to be changing, yet everything has already been decided. From a human perspective, it feels uncertain and unresolved. But from God's perspective, the outcome is already settled. God does not react to situations as they develop. He operates with full knowledge of the end from the beginning. When God has scheduled something, no delay, resistance, or opposition can cancel it. God's plans are not spontaneous or improvised. They are intentional, ordered, and purposeful. Long before we recognize a need, God has already prepared the answer. What feels sudden to us is often the manifestation of something God arranged long ago. The surprise is not that God acts, but that He acts precisely when He chooses, not when we expect. Many people struggle because they measure progress by what they can see. When visible evidence is absent, they assume nothing is happening. But God's work often occurs invisibly before it becomes visible. Just as seeds grow underground before breaking the surface, God's plans develop quietly before they are revealed publicly. The lack of visible change does not mean the schedule has been canceled. God's timing is not influenced by pressure, panic, or impatience. He is not rushed by human urgency, nor delayed by human weakness. When the appointed time arrives, circumstances align with precision. Doors open that could not be forced open before. Resistance fades without explanation. What once seemed impossible becomes accessible. Timing transforms struggle into clarity. One reason God establishes his own schedule is to ensure that his purpose, not human ambition, is fulfilled. If outcomes arrived according to our preferences, they would often serve comfort rather than calling. God's timing ensures that blessings align with responsibility and purpose. When God releases something at the right time, it strengthens rather than distracts. God's scheduled moments often arrive after endurance has been tested. Faith that has survived waiting, disappointment, and uncertainty is prepared to handle fulfillment. The waiting season builds capacity. It teaches gratitude, humility, and dependence on God. When the moment finally comes, the heart is ready to receive without being consumed by pride or fear. There are times when it feels like opposition is increasing rather than decreasing. This can be discouraging, but resistance does not mean the plan is failing. In many cases, resistance intensifies just before the breakthrough. Pressure often precedes release. God allows tension to build so that the outcome clearly reflects his intervention rather than human manipulation. God's schedule also accounts for factors beyond individual lives. His plans often involve multiple people, environments, and events. While one person waits, others are being prepared. While one door remains closed, another is being built. God's timing synchronizes lives in ways that cannot be rushed. What seems like delay is often coordination. Impatience can tempt people to force outcomes prematurely. When that happens, the result may resemble the promise, but lack the fullness of God's intention. Forced doors often lead to unnecessary struggle. God's schedule protects from shortcuts that compromise purpose. Waiting preserves integrity and ensures that the outcome is sustainable. Trusting God's timing requires surrendering control. It means believing that God knows not only what is best, but when it is best. This kind of trust frees the heart from anxiety and comparison. Instead of striving to keep up with others, faith rests in the confidence that God's plan is personal and precise. Preparation is often the responsibility during the waiting period. While the outcome is scheduled by God, readiness is developed through faithfulness. Growth, discipline, learning, and obedience prepare the heart for what is coming. When preparation meets God's timing, momentum is released. When God's scheduled moment arrives, it often feels sudden, but it is never accidental. What changes in an instant may have taken years to prepare. The shift may be dramatic, but the process was intentional. God's timing reveals his sovereignty and faithfulness. Living with the awareness that God has already scheduled the outcome changes perspective. Instead of despairing in uncertainty, faith anticipates fulfillment. Instead of rushing, trust waits with expectation. God's plans cannot be delayed by opposition or undone by circumstance. When the time comes, what God has decided will come to pass. Faith is not proven in moments of ease, but in seasons when everything feels uncertain. When life becomes unpredictable, fear tries to take control of the narrative. It whispers worst-case scenarios, magnifies obstacles, and convinces the heart to expect disappointment. But faith responds differently. Faith does not deny reality. It reinterprets reality through trust in God. Living with expectation instead of fear is a deliberate choice to believe that God is present, purposeful, and powerful, even when circumstances are unclear. Fear thrives on the unknown. It feeds on unanswered questions and unresolved situations. When outcomes are uncertain, fear assumes loss, failure, or harm. Faith, however, assumes God's involvement. It believes that uncertainty is not emptiness, but space. Space for God to move, reveal, and surprise. Faith does not require full understanding to remain confident. It rests in who God is, not in what is known. Expectation shifts the focus from what could go wrong to what God could do. It does not guarantee comfort, but it anchors hope. When expectation replaces fear, the heart stays open instead of guarded. Fear closes the spirit and prepares for disappointment. Expectation opens the spirit and prepares for divine involvement. This posture changes how people wait, pray, and respond. Living with expectation requires intentional trust. It means resisting the urge to interpret delay as disaster. Many fears are rooted in timing. Things are not happening when expected, so the mind fills the gap with anxiety. Expectation fills that same gap with hope. It says that God is not absent in the waiting and the pause is not pointless. God's silence does not mean his refusal. Expectation also changes how people interpret challenges. Instead of viewing obstacles as signs to retreat, expectation views them as indicators that something meaningful is unfolding. Resistance no longer signals defeat, it suggests importance. Faith learns to ask not only what is happening, but what God may be preparing through it. Fear drains energy and clarity. It causes people to make defensive decisions, settle prematurely, or abandon what God has spoken. Expectation, on the other hand, sustains endurance. It provides the strength to keep showing up, keep believing, and keep obeying even when results are delayed. Expectation fuels perseverance because it believes the story is not finished. Living with expectation does not mean ignoring pain or pretending everything is fine. It means refusing to let pain define the future. Faith acknowledges disappointment without surrendering hope. It allows grief without abandoning trust. Expectation says that today's struggle does not have the authority to cancel tomorrow's promise. Expectation also guards the heart against comparison. Fear often arises when people measure their progress against others. When someone else receives what we are waiting for, our fear suggests we have been overlooked. Expectation counters that lie by trusting that God's plan is personal and precise. What God is doing in someone else's life does not delay what he has planned for another. Faith rests in God's individualized timing. Another aspect of expectation is readiness. Expectation prepares rather than panics. It cultivates growth, discipline, and faithfulness while waiting. Fear wastes energy worrying about outcomes that may never occur. Expectation invests energy into becoming ready for whatever God brings. It asks, who am I becoming while I wait? Instead of, what if this never happens? Expectation transforms prayer. Fear prays from desperation, but expectation prays from confidence. It speaks to God with trust rather than panic. It thanks God in advance, not because the outcome is known, but because God's character is trusted. Expectant prayer keeps faith alive even when answers are delayed. Living with expectation also influences how people speak. Fear-based language is filled with doubt, negativity, and resignation. Expectation speaks life, hope, and possibility. Words shape perspective. When expectation governs speech, it reinforces trust and strengthens belief. Speaking with expectation does not control outcomes, but it aligns the heart with faith rather than fear. Expectation requires courage because it chooses hope in the face of uncertainty. It refuses to settle into pessimism as a form of self-protection. Fear tells people to lower expectations to avoid disappointment. Faith dares to expect because it believes God is faithful. Even if the path includes challenges, God invites his people to live expectantly, not anxiously. Expectation does not demand outcomes. It trusts God's wisdom. It remains open, patient, and hopeful. This posture allows peace to coexist with uncertainty. Instead of being consumed by what might go wrong, faith stays anchored in what God can do when expectation replaces fear. Waiting becomes purposeful rather than painful. Uncertainty becomes opportunity rather than threat. Life is no longer driven by anxiety about the future, but guided by trust in God's presence. Expectation does not remove challenges, but it changes how they are faced, confident that God is still at work even now. God often brings people to moments where they must decide whether they truly believe what they say they believe. These moments are not dramatic on the surface, but they are defining internally. They test whether faith is rooted in convenience or conviction. When pressure increases and certainty decreases, what remains reveals the depth of trust in God. Faith that endures is not emotional, it is anchored. There is a difference between believing God can and believing God will. Many are comfortable acknowledging God's power in theory, yet struggle to trust his faithfulness personally. True faith is built when God is trusted not only for miracles, but for direction, timing, and purpose. It rests in the assurance that God is consistent, even when circumstances are unstable. Life has a way of exposing weak foundations. When everything is calm, faith can seem strong. But when disappointment, loss, or delay enters the picture, faith is either refined or replaced. These seasons are not meant to destroy belief, but to strengthen it. God allows testing not to prove something to himself, but to reveal something to us. What survives the test becomes unshakable. Trusting God fully means releasing the need to understand everything. Many people want faith with explanations, but faith does not operate by full clarity. If every step were explained, trust would be unnecessary. God often provides just enough light for the next step, not the entire journey. This teaches dependence rather than independence. Faith also requires consistency. It is easy to trust God when progress is visible, but faith is sustained when progress is hidden. Consistent trust chooses obedience, prayer, and faithfulness even when results are delayed. This kind of faith is not driven by outcomes, but by relationship. It stays connected to God regardless of circumstances. God values faith that remains steady over time. Sudden bursts of belief are encouraging, but enduring faith is transformational. This is the faith that continues to serve, give, love, and hope even when expectations are unmet. Endurance builds spiritual strength. It develops patience, resilience, and maturity that cannot be formed quickly. Disappointment is one of the greatest tests of faith. When expectations are unmet, trust is challenged. It is tempting to withdraw, become guarded, or lower belief to avoid further hurt. But faith chooses to remain open. It allows God to redefine expectations rather than abandoning hope altogether. Faith learns that unmet expectations are not always rejection. Sometimes they are redirection. Faith also grows when it learns to wait without becoming passive. Waiting does not mean doing nothing. It means trusting actively. It continues to believe, prepare, and obey while trusting God with the outcome. Active waiting refuses to quit. Even when motivation fades, it stays committed to God's process. Another test of faith is whether it can celebrate others without resentment. When God blesses someone else while we are still waiting, faith is challenged. Trust believes that God's supply is not limited and his plans are not competitive. Someone else's breakthrough does not delay ours. Faith rejoices without comparison because it trusts God's personal timing. Faith matures when it stops demanding guarantees. It learns to trust God's character rather than specific outcomes. This does not mean faith becomes passive or indifferent. It becomes resilient. It knows that even if circumstances do not unfold as expected, God remains faithful and purposeful. God often uses prolonged seasons to establish deep trust. Quick answers may bring relief, but long journeys build intimacy. Walking with God through uncertainty develops familiarity with his voice and confidence in his guidance. Over time, faith becomes less reactive and more rooted. When faith is anchored, fear loses its grip. Fear thrives on uncertainty, but faith rests in God's sovereignty. Anchored faith does not eliminate questions, but it prevents questions from becoming obstacles. It allows peace to coexist with uncertainty. Faith that has been tested becomes a testimony. It carries credibility because it has survived challenge. This kind of faith encourages others not by perfection, but by perseverance. It shows that trusting God is not about avoiding difficulty, but about remaining confident through it. God honors faith that endures, not because faith earns rewards, but because enduring faith stays aligned with God's purpose. When trust remains intact, hearts are prepared to recognize God's movement when it comes. Faith that stands firm through testing is ready to receive what God releases next. In the end, faith is not just believing that God will act, but trusting Him while He works. It remains steady when answers are delayed, paths are unclear, and outcomes are unknown. This kind of faith does not collapse under pressure, it grows stronger. And when God moves, it recognizes His hand, not as a surprise, but as a fulfillment long trusted.